Now, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jerry Vieira. Now, Jerry is the past president of our chapter, and this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for us to be speaking with Jerry. Now, Jerry is a certified management consultant, and he's the president and founder of the QMP Group, Inc. It was founded in 1990. QMP has helped hundreds of small to medium business-to-business clients diagnose and supercharge their marketing and sales engines and grow their revenue, earnings, and corporate value. An electrical engineer, musician, and MBA by formal education, Jerry's professional career included management assignments in engineering, manufacturing, and marketing and sales for Fortune 500, pre-IPO, and small, medium business-to-business firms from Massachusetts to Connecticut, Texas, and Oregon. Jerry's the author of 2 books in the past 2 years, The Consultancy Navigator and Navigational Selling. He is currently writing the 3rd in the QMP Marketing and Sales Navigation series, Winning Against the Big Ships, Navigational Strategies for SMB to B firms. Jerry spends his time writing, composing, and fishing in the rivers and ocean of Northwestern Oregon. Jerry, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to learn what you're doing new.
Thank you, John. As soon as I find my share button, we ought to be able to get started here. Okay, we're going to, this is going to be kind of a roller coaster ride. They say that engineers describe elephants by starting with a blood cell and working their way up. And so I'm sure this won't disappoint those people who expect that of engineers. And as Machiko says, engineers have difficulty talking to normal people. Thank you, Machiko. That's very true. And I'll prove it here, assuming you're all normal people. But let's get started about innovation. This is the quick agenda. We want to understand what real innovation is, talk about how innovation is impacted by the client value quotient, talk about how innovations diffuse into a market, and then talk about the impact of that diffusion of innovation on how we, the people in this room, deliver management consulting. So I searched a little bit to try to find a good quote about what an innovation was, and this was the best of a bad lot. But I chose it because I think most people would agree that when you first are exposed to an innovation, it seems like magic. There are so many innovations that we wonder about, you know, why didn't somebody think of this ahead of time? This is brilliant. Or why did they waste their time designing and building and selling this? It's absolutely useless. And we're going to talk about how an innovation has client value or doesn't have client value, how that value is communicated from buyer to buyer or consumer to consumer or customer to customer in a market, and what levers to pull to test the value of an innovation and get it adopted quickly. So here's my personal journey to understanding innovation. Francisco, if you're still on board here, we both worked at Texas Instruments, and Texas Instruments was an innovation company of a semiconductor innovation company. And then I met a gentleman, PhD, who his name was Dr. Doug Zemer. And I understand Dr. Zemer is still alive. He's 92 years old in Dallas. And he wrote a fantastic paper on adoption of innovation and how it gets adopted into a marketplace, and published it in the Elsevier you can read this, Technological Forecasting and Social Change Journal. And then I was at the Barnes & Noble and looked at the bargain shelves, and I came across this book, The Diffusion of Innovation. And then there was one book that was on the same shelf. I want to assure you that I am not a religious person, and not everybody appreciates what I'm about to say, but the book that was right next to it was this book. And it struck me that here was something that 2,000 years ago was an innovation. And at the time, it was beset by a tremendous amount of social antagonism. And yet it succeeded and lasted 2,000 years. So what struck me is that if you look at the diffusion of innovations, the technological forecasting and social change, and look at the history of a religion, any religion, it just happened to be this one that the book was written about, how does a philosophical innovation as well as technical innovations succeed? Are there common threads between all of this? And it turns out there are, and I'm going to share some of those common threads. And oh, by the way, my own contribution for innovation came in one US patent for a timing circuit back in 1970 something, just after Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. So innovations can occur in any phase of life. There are technological innovations, process innovations, philosophical, political, healthcare, religious, and online commerce as an example, or scientific innovations. So the way you can test the effectiveness is how has it improved daily life? Oops, got to go back. You may have heard the name Peter Drucker before, a professor well known for strategy, and he has purported to have said, offer me $1 million of market research or a day in the kitchen with a housewife, and I'll select the day in the kitchen. Of course, he had no ill intent against the housewife. What he wanted to do was immerse himself in the experiences of the housewife as she went about her tasks. Now, I use the word housewife, but you have to remember times have changed, but back in the day, when he was in his prime, a housewife was a noble a noble job and a very common set of things. Those were the days of one-car families, working husbands, stay-at-home moms. So what really happens is that if you ask a client, if you look at the lower corner of this little chart here, you ask a client what they would like to see improved, they're going to give you the conscious, explicit answer. They're going to say, let's assume that's a stove. Back in the day when he was looking at the housewife, if he had asked the housewife what they would like in a stove, they might say, I'd like one that cleans the oven automatically. I'd like one that has a clock that didn't break after about 2 weeks. I'd like one that you can change the colors of the panel in case I decide to paint the kitchen a little bit different. Those are reactive changes. Those are not innovations. On the other hand, if you understood the problems that anybody in any situation in life has, the challenges of the day-to-day experience, then you are led to see their problems, the opportunities and the gaps they have, the challenges that they're facing, and design innovation. So around those problems, and you what? To move. The housewife would have never said back in the day, I'd like a microwave oven. But considering the pressures they were under of time, at the time, people were changing to working housewives. They were pressured. They were still under pressure to be good moms and good stay-at-home moms and good housekeepers. So microwave oven fit so many of the needs. It was an innovation and it was adopted quickly into the marketplace. And there was nothing that had to change to enable it. It was usually space on a kitchen counter for it or under a cabinet. So as much as possible, Drucker was right. You want to spend your time understanding the client experience, thinking about the client experience, and finding ways to innovate the client experience that were implicit in the task and subconscious. And how do you know it's subconscious? Well, if you come up with an innovation and people start to say, well, that's great, I wish I had thought of it, it means that you've tapped into some subconscious need and it's implicit in the task. That is the place that Apple spends its time, in that upper right-hand corner. But an innovation, just because it's new, must have some value. And I'm going to talk about the client value quotient. And I want to read this so that I put proper emphasis. Any economic value accruing to a firm has as its source the consumer's perception that they will receive greater economic, emotional, physical, social, and political value from your product or service than it costs them economically, emotionally, socially, politically, or physically to acquire and use it. And that's a quotient. Benefits over costs is value. Now, there are 5 components of both value and costs: economic costs, emotional costs, physical costs, social costs. That should say political. Why didn't you tell me there was a mistake there, Jerry? That should say political. And so the equation looks like this. As I warned you, engineers talking to normal people use equations. So BEC stands for economic benefits, BEM stands for emotional benefits, CPH stands for physical, CPO stands for cost, political. And people subconsciously balance all of these things, hoping that they can come up with a value quotient that they perceive is greater than 1. The benefits need to outweigh the costs. Now, naturally, the benefits economic and the cost economic can be easily calculated. You can find a numerical calculation. Spent a lot of time as an engineer in manufacturing doing economic benefits of buying capital equipment for projects. And of course, you were only focused there. But in normal decision making, emotions, physical comfort, social influence, and political consequences also enter into it. And so your innovation, in order to be adopted, needs to understand the implications on the target customer of all of these factors so that you can develop reasonable, plausible purchase benefit stories. Now, here's some study that was done. It was published in a book called Design and Marketing New Products by Urban and Hauser, and it was a textbook. But if you look at these things on the right-hand side here and ask yourself what the problem is that causes products to fail, you'd be surprised that the majority, I think all except one, are responsible, the responsibility of the strategic marketer. So the problem is in strategic marketing. If you have an innovation, a claimed innovation, it does not necessarily mean that if you can throw enough money at it, that it will succeed. Your product and innovation needs to be new and different. It has to be perceived as having a real benefit. And it has to really understand and respond to customers' POG, P-O-G, that stands for problem, opportunity, or gap. Innovations mature at birth. They look at a completely new value quotient. In their teenage years, when they get adopted at an increasing rate, they're adding capacity to overheated market demand. In their adult phase, they need to exploit a competitive advantage because a good innovation will always attract imitators. And so you need to have strong competitive advantage in the later stages. And in the end, old age provides outstanding service and reassurance because that's how laggards buy innovation. Now, here's a complex chart. This was put together by, as I told you, Doug Zemer and published in that journal. This is how the diffusion of automobiles occurred. You can see back in 1896, that's way down here on the far left lower corner here, automobiles were introduced into the marketplace. And then over the next 100 years, they eventually penetrated and occupied all of the sockets. Now, a socket is a place where an innovation can find use. Eventually, automobiles saturated the marketplace. And the reason that line continues to increase is because the general population increases and the number of household increases. And so an innovation, a valuable innovation like an automobile, continues to fill the sockets available for it, and the number of sockets continue to rise. The line below it is the annual sales. And I highlighted a couple of points here. In 1929, you can see this tremendous dip in sales of automobiles. 1929 was the Great Depression. in 1945, from 41 to 45, there was a tremendous drop again in the demand for automobiles because that was World War II and factory capacity was converted to military vehicles. But even as much as these significant drops occurred, the line of installed base, the number of automobiles, continued its relentless journey to fill every socket available. So basically, the general form of products adoption is the first phase, I'll call it phase A, people buy based on the value proposition. Then as more and more people get informed of the benefits associated with the commodity, then it draws competition and people have a preference for based on some competitive advantage. And the laggards buy based on support. So let's say it was a tablet. The first one might say, I'd like to buy tablets for my sales force because it allows them to get rapid access to inventory. And they are the visionaries. They are the people that are ahead of the pack. Then people will come to buying tablets by saying, hey, I'd like to buy a tablet, but I'm not sure which one to buy. But if I don't buy it, I can't stay competitive with my competitors. And I need to put it in place. Which one should I buy? And then the laggards say, oh, damn it, I got to buy tablets for my people. Let's make sure we buy them reliable because I don't want to have to go through this again. So there's philosophical, there's social, there's personal, there's all kinds of reasons that people adopt an innovation. And of course, as you adopt an innovation, as the market saturates, then people are more and more difficult to sell. So here's an example of how the small fuel economy cars were adopted into the marketplace. Now, at the time in 1980, the big three automakers had 90% market share. General Motors had 50%, and yet the Asian automotive manufacturers were able to penetrate that market. Now, it was a perfect storm of what was going on at that time. Inflation was high, interest rates were high, gasoline prices were skyrocketing. More and more women were entering the workforce. The guys were coming home from Vietnam and setting up families, and because interest rates were so high, they needed to have two wage earners in the family. So there was a demand for a second car. And the second car was usually the car that was going to be driven by the housewife or the minted female worker. It had to be reliable. It had to be easy to handle. And so what happened, there was slower growth and the introduction of a quality-based, fuel-efficient car created demand and a higher growth rate. So what happened was you went from a growth rate of sales like this here, relatively flat, to an accelerated growth rate based on sociological change. And then once that position was established, then the Asian automakers began to upgrade their products based on the leverage associated with a quality brand and eroded market share. So what's the point of this slide? The point of this slide is that if your client is introducing products in the mature phase of an innovation curve, the only way to continue to grow profitably is to fragment themselves by creating subsegment value propositions for subsegments of the market and then leveraging them. Because if they don't do it themselves, then competitors will. So you can fragment the market in all cases. Here's another story. This one has to do with the introduction of the SUV, which did the same thing. It fragmented the market. It repackaged the value proposition and provided more rapid growth at higher selling prices and higher margins. And then here's another example. This one is the digital camera. At the time the digital camera came out, everybody that wanted a single lens reflex camera had a single lens reflex camera. And by introducing it, they were able to fragment the market and rejuvenate sales. But one thing to understand about this kind of an innovation is that this one depended on another technology being adopted into the marketplace to enable the use and reproduction of the photos taken by the digital, and that was the personal computer. So sometimes innovations are truly innovations, but they're hindered a little bit by the adoption of an enabling technology. Okay, so the last thing I'll say about the adoption of innovation is that it is definitely a sociological phenomenon. It is a sociological phenomenon, and it is enabled by networks, personal networks, professional networks, and it is driven by opinion leaders that become true believers in whatever the innovation does and the value it provides. They have to be well networked, have high credibility in the network, and be natural salespeople. Over the years that I've talked about innovation, I've had to change the photos in here to match the contemporary things. It's amazing how some of the people that used to be opinion leaders lost their position. So now the fastest way to accelerate the adoption of an innovation is through the intramarket network. Every market has an intramarket network through which peers communicate. Here are the opinion leaders. The venues are where they hang out. The vehicles are what they read. The referral sources eventually get to the executives in charge or the ultimate decision maker. It can be a consumer, the head of the household, for example, or it can be a team. But it usually, the influence, the message, usually is directed in terms of the arrows. Referral sources and opinion leaders write for the vehicles. They speak at the conferences. The referral sources pick up on what the opinion leaders have and communicate to the executives in charge. I'm going to give you a quick example. Here's a company that listened to an adoption of innovation talk I gave. I guess it had to be almost 12 years ago now. It was quite a while. But they were struggling. It was a startup and they weren't getting rapid adoption and they didn't know why. In fact, when they came up to me after the talk, they told me that they were fighting all the time, arguing, in the sense of arguing, about where they should focus. Doing some quick data analytics, Machiko, of where they were selling and which of the customers that they were selling to was the happiest. In other words, the ones that were receiving the highest value quotient of their innovative software, and refocusing on that, they were able to gain 1,000 new installations of their software just by analyzing it and finding that one, I'd call it an oddball value quotient that was really high. When they asked that client why they bought, they found that there were 25,000 companies like that company around the country, none of which had a good solution to their problem. And it was further enabled by, they had an intramarket network where 25 of their customer base would meet to share best practices. So they're able to take this one customer and his success story, plant it in that intramarket network for those best practice sharing meetings in the market that had high demand, and accelerate the growth. And it cost them less money. So we're talking about the ability to increase and get yourself up this curve very rapidly if you understand the dynamics. I will tell you this, that the most common problem, fallacy that I run into in dealing with clients is called the everyone can use it. So you ask the customer or the client, where do people buy these and who can use this? And they say, well, everybody can use it. And you know they're correct, but not everybody gets the same value. Not every client receives the same magnitude and type of value from your product or service. It makes sense that those who perceive the greatest value are more likely to buy, pay more for it, be happier with it, tell others like themselves about it, and return where they need more. Always begin there. And this is a quote from something that a guy named Jerry Vieira wrote a while ago. I ask forgiveness for quoting myself. Okay, so let me kind of close this out by saying, how does understanding diffusion help consultants help clients? Well, if you look at this and say, okay, there are phases here, there are basically 3 phases of innovation. If you're a recruiter and you know that your client is in phase 1 of a true innovation, then there are certain considerations that you should bring to bear on finding the right candidate. If you're in phase B, there are a series of other considerations. In phase C, there are a series of other considerations. And if you're a marketer, there are a series of considerations depending on which phase you're in. If you're a sales consultant, the same thing. If you're a career coach, the same set of considerations. Finance and accounting consultants, I'm going to stop here for a second, because here's the thing. The salespeople come in with a forecast claiming an innovation, and they come in with a marketing budget that's going to penetrate the market. But you find that you're right here. The truth is, it's not really an innovation. It's an evolved product, and you're in phase C. In phase C, you can spend all the money you want, but all of the sockets are already occupied, and you're going to have to rip market share away from your competitors, which is the toughest market strategy to try to deploy. On the other hand, if you're in an A phase, and you're listening to these forecasts about how much inventory you should have, and you're worried about the fact that they're saying everybody can use it and everybody's going to buy it once they see it, the best thing that you can say is, how about we do this? How about we just focus on the market that's going to receive the greatest value, see if it takes off, and put in place enough inventory to handle that step. Once we get a foothold in that market, then we can expand out. So finance and accounting consultants, every form of consulting that I could think of can be affected, and you can become more effective in assisting and advising your client if you understand where they truly are, where their products and services are on the diffusion. So let me close out. The value quotient is important because it helps focus on the markets that have the best network and receive the highest value quotient. That's where you should focus, no matter what phase of the marketing cycle you're on. A client that understands adoption is much more valuable to their clients because they can help them make decisions on everything from inventory to personnel resources to marketing investment. If they understand the true nature of the value quotient that's being delivered, the market size and the number of sockets that are unfilled, and set realistic expectations. The next thing they should remember is that innovation stages evolve. I have been involved with products that reach the maturity phase in few years. Other markets take 50, 60 years. Do you know, does anybody know when the first SUV was produced? You're not going to believe it, but the first version of an SUV was produced in 1935 by Chevrolet. But it didn't take off till the 1970s. And so finally, I'll give you the kind of the mantra that you should make sure that you're offering solutions and services that recognize the impact of the adoption of innovation dynamic going on in your client's firm. That's it. I told you it was going to be a roller coaster ride and be fast, so that's all I've got.